be surprised," continued Lucy, "because, of course, he never mentioned it to any of your family. It is a great secret, and none of my relations know of it except Anne. I would never have told you if I had not trusted you completely. And I really thought I ought to explain my behaviour in asking about Mrs. Ferrars. I know Mr. Ferrars will not be displeased when he hears I have told you, because he has the highest opinion in the world of all your family, and looks on you and the other Miss Dashwoods quite as his own sisters." Eleanor forced herself to speak calmly. "May I ask how long you've been engaged?" "We've been engaged for 4 years now." 4 years. Eleanor still felt unable to believe it. "My sister and I often stayed at my uncle's house near Plymouth, here in Devonshire. Edward came to study law there for 4 years, and so we met and became engaged. I was very unwilling to enter into it, as you may imagine, without his mother's approval. But I was too young and loved him too well to be as cautious as I ought to have been. Dear Edward! Look, I carry his picture everywhere with me." She took from her pocket a small painting and showed it to Eleanor. Eleanor's last doubts of the truth of Lucy's story disappeared as she recognised Edward's face. "You can't think how I am suffering," continued Lucy. "Everything is so uncertain, and we see each other so infrequently. I wonder my heart is not broken." Here she put a hand to her eyes, but Eleanor did not feel sympathetic. "Sometimes," Lucy added, "I think it would be better for both of us if I broke off the engagement completely." She looked sharply at her companion. "But then I cannot bear the thought of making him miserable. And to me, too, he is so very dear. What would you advise me to do, Miss Dashwood?" "I am afraid I cannot advise you in such a situation. You must decide for yourself." "Poor Edward! His mother must provide for him one day, but he is so depressed about his future. Did you not think him unhappy when he arrived at Barton recently?" "Yes," said Eleanor, aware of yet another fact in support of Lucy's story. "He had been staying with us at my uncle's. It made him so miserable, not being able to stay more than a fortnight and seeing me so upset. He still feels just the same. I heard from him before I left Exeter." Taking a letter from her pocket, she waved the envelope in Eleanor's direction. Eleanor recognised Edward's writing and finally had to accept that they must be engaged. Her heart sank within her. "Poor Edward does not even have a picture of me," Lucy went on, "although I have his. But I gave him a lock of my hair in a ring recently, and that was some comfort to him, he said. Perhaps you noticed the ring on his finger?" "I did," said Eleanor. Her voice was calm, but her calmness hid an unhappiness greater than she had ever felt before. She was shocked, confused, and miserable. Here their conversation ended, and Eleanor was left alone to think. She felt sure that Edward's affection was still hers. He certainly loved her, and had never intentionally deceived her. Unfortunately, he was now tied by an early and foolish engagement to a pretty but insincere, vulgar, and selfish girl whose main interest lay in his future income. Eleanor's tears flowed more for Edward than herself. She had lost her chance of happiness with him, but would only be miserable for a time, while he had nothing at all to look forward to in life. Over the next few days, Eleanor took great care to hide her unhappiness. She was glad to spare her family the shocking news of Edward's secret engagement, as she knew that their affection and sorrow would only add to her misery. At convenient moments, she returned to the subject in quiet conversation with Lucy. She learnt that Lucy was determined to hold Edward to the engagement, and that Lucy was jealous of her because Edward apparently always spoke of her with great admiration. Indeed, what other reason could Lucy have for telling Eleanor her secret, if not to warn her to keep away from Edward? Eleanor realised with great sadness that Edward was not only without affection for his future wife, but that he had not even the chance of being reasonably happy in marriage. Chapter 6. Eleanor and Marianne in London. Mrs. Jennings now began to make plans to return to her house in London, and quite unexpectedly invited the elder Miss Dashwoods to stay with her there. "I've set my heart on it," she said in her comfortable way. "We shall have a very pleasant time together, I know, and if you do not like to go visiting with me, you can always go with one of my daughters. I have had such good luck finding husbands for my girls that I am sure your mother will think me a suitable person to look after you. If I don't get at least one of you married, it won't be my fault." Eleanor was unwilling to accept, as she knew that her mother would miss her and Marianne very much. She was also aware that Edward and the Miss Steeles would be in London at that time, and wished to avoid meeting them. But Marianne's eagerness to see Willoughby, who would most likely be in town by then, gave Mrs. Dashwood an excellent reason for insisting that they should accept Mrs. Jennings' generous invitation, and so it was agreed. During the 3-day journey, Eleanor had plenty of opportunity to compare Marianne's delightful expectations with her own acceptance of a cheerless future. It was clear from Marianne's bright eyes and happy smiles that she depended on finding Willoughby in London, and Eleanor determined to find out more about his character and intentions. On their arrival at Mrs. Jennings' handsome house, the young ladies were given Charlotte's old room, a large and comfortable apartment. Eleanor immediately sat down to write to her mother, and Marianne also sat down with pen and paper. "I am writing home, Marianne," said Eleanor. "Perhaps you should put off writing for a day or two." "I am not writing to Mamma," replied Marianne quickly. Eleanor realised Marianne must be writing to Willoughby, and thought with pleasure that the fact of their corresponding must mean they were engaged. The letters were finished and sent to the post. During the rest of the evening, Marianne appeared very agitated. She ate almost nothing, and seemed to be anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. Suddenly, after dinner, there was a knock on the front door, and Marianne jumped up, moving eagerly towards the sitting-room door. She could not help crying, "Oh, Eleanor, it is Willoughby!" and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms when Colonel Brandon entered. It was too great a shock to bear with calmness, and she immediately left the room. Eleanor greeted the Colonel. She was particularly sorry that a man so in love with her sister should see that Marianne felt nothing but bitter disappointment in meeting him. He was clearly astonished and concerned to see Marianne leave the room in such a way. "Is your sister ill?" he asked anxiously. Eleanor answered unwillingly that she was, and talked of headaches and overtiredness and anything that could reasonably explain her sister's behaviour. Their conversation continued on more impersonal subjects, until Mrs. Jennings entered the room with all her usual noisy cheerfulness. "Oh, Colonel," said she, "I am so glad to see you, and you see, I have brought 2 young ladies with me. Your friend Miss Marianne is here too. You will not be sorry to hear that. I don't know what you and Mr. Willoughby will do about her, between you. But, Colonel, where have you been since we saw you at Barton Park? Come, let's have no secrets among friends." He replied politely, but gave no real answer, and did not stay long. The ladies all agreed to go to bed early. The next morning Marianne looked happy again. Yesterday's disappointment seemed forgotten in the cheerful expectation of what was to happen that day. They spent the morning shopping in a fashionable part of London with Mrs. Palmer. During this time Marianne was restless and inattentive, always looking out at the street, and wildly impatient to be at home again. As soon as they returned, she ran in eagerly. "Has no letter been left for me?" she asked the servant. "No, miss," he replied. "Are you quite sure? No card, or letter, or note?" "How very strange," she said in a low, disappointed voice. Strange indeed, Eleanor thought worriedly. If Willoughby is in town, why does he not come or write? "Oh, my dear mother, You must be wrong to permit an engagement between a daughter so young and a man so little known to continue in such a doubtful and mysterious manner." For the rest of the day, Marianne seemed agitated, unable to concentrate on anything. When they met at breakfast the next morning, Mrs. Jennings said, "If this sunny weather goes on much longer, Sir John will not want to leave Barton to come to London. It's a sad thing for a sportsman to lose a day's shooting." "That is true," cried Marianne, suddenly cheerful. "I had not thought of that. This fine weather will keep many sportsmen in the country, but now it is January, it cannot last. I expect we shall have frost soon, and then they will all come to town. Why, it may even freeze tonight." During the next few days, Eleanor was both amused and saddened to see Marianne's newfound interest in the weather. "The wind has changed, has it not, Eleanor? I feel sure it is colder than this morning. I think we shall have a frost tonight." Mrs. Jennings was always very kind to her two young guests. Her domestic arrangements were generous, and her friends were pleasant, if a little dull. Colonel Brandon visited them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Eleanor, who saw with concern his continued affection for her sister. About a week after their arrival, they discovered Willoughby's card on the table when they returned from their morning's drive. "Good heavens!" cried Marianne. "He has been here while we were out." From this moment her mind was never quiet. The expectation of seeing him every hour of the day made her unfit for anything. She insisted on being left at home the next morning when the others went out. When a note was delivered the next day, she stepped quickly forward to take it. "For me!" she cried. But it was for Mrs. Jennings, and she was again disappointed. "You are expecting a letter, then?" said Eleanor, unable to keep silent any longer. "Yes, a little, not much." There was a short pause. "You have no confidence in me, Marianne?" "Eleanor, how can you say that? You have confidence in no one." "Me?" replied Eleanor in some confusion. "Indeed, Marianne, I have nothing to tell." "Nor I," answered Marianne firmly. "So our situations are alike. Neither of us has anything to tell, you because you communicate nothing, and I because I hide nothing." And Eleanor, aware that she had promised not to tell Lucy Steele's secret, felt she could not demand greater openness from Marianne than she was herself ready to offer. The next evening was spent at a dance at Lady Middleton's London home. Once Marianne realised Willoughby was not present, she took no interest in any of the guests, and complained that she found dancing too tiring. But worse was yet to come. On their return, Mrs. Jennings told them that Willoughby had been invited, and expressed her surprise that he had not appeared. Marianne looked extremely hurt, and Eleanor decided to write to their mother, asking her to find out the truth from Marianne. Eleanor had only just finished her letter the next morning when Colonel Brandon arrived. Marianne, who hated visitors of any kind except one, left the room before he entered it, and Eleanor found herself alone with him. He sat for a time without saying a word, and then asked her, in an agitated manner, whether he should congratulate her on gaining a brother-in-law. Eleanor was not prepared for such a question, and asked him what he meant. He tried to smile as he continued, "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known." "Her own family do not know it," Eleanor answered. Surprised, he said, "I am so sorry. I fear you may think me impolite. I had not supposed any secrecy was intended, as they openly correspond. Just now, when the servant let me in, I saw an envelope in his hand with Mr. Willoughby's address on it in your sister's writing. I came to inquire, but I am afraid I know the answer. Is it impossible for me to... But I would have no chance of succeeding. Tell me, I beg you, that it is all arranged. Then I shall have no choice but to hide my feelings." I am not astonished to hear of their correspondence," replied Eleanor, choosing her words carefully, "and I am well aware of the affection they have for each other, although they have not yet informed us of the details of their engagement." He listened silently. "I wish your sister all imaginable happiness, and I hope that Willoughby will try to deserve her," he said in a voice full of feeling, and then rose to leave. In the next few days, Willoughby neither came nor wrote. Marianne was losing hope, becoming depressed, and careless of her appearance. She took no pleasure in dressing for a party she and Eleanor were to attend with Lady Middleton. When they arrived in the hot, crowded room, she sank into a chair, not even looking at the other guests. Eleanor, however, saw Willoughby standing nearby, in conversation with a very elegant young lady. She turned to Marianne, who noticed him at that moment. Her whole face shone with sudden delight, and she would have run to him at once if her sister had not caught hold of her. "Good heavens!" Marianne cried. "He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" "I beg you, be calm," said Eleanor. "Try to hide your feelings." But this was impossible for Marianne. She sat there, her anxiety and impatience written clearly on her face. At last, Willoughby turned round and looked at them both. Marianne jumped up and held out her hand affectionately to him. He came closer and spoke to Eleanor rather than her sister, asking in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood. Marianne blushed deeply and cried, "What is the meaning of this, Willoughby? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not avoid it then, but he held her hand only for a moment. "I did myself the honour of calling on you last week, when you were unfortunately not at home." "But have you not received my letters?" cried Marianne in the wildest anxiety. "There must be some terrible mistake. Tell me, Willoughby, I beg you, what is the matter?" He looked ashamed, but on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had been talking, his expression seemed to harden. "Yes," he said, "I had the pleasure of receiving information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send me," and turned away to join his friend. Marianne, looking horribly white, was unable to stand, and Eleanor helped her to a chair. Soon Willoughby was seen to leave the party, and as Marianne was clearly unwell, Eleanor asked Lady Middleton to take them home. Nothing was said between the sisters, as Marianne was suffering too much to speak. Eleanor now realised that for Willoughby the attachment was over, and she felt extreme distaste for his manner of ending it. Neither sister slept much that night, and it was still dark when Eleanor was woken by the sound of agitated sobbing. She saw Marianne, only half-dressed, writing as fast as a constant flow of tears would permit her. "Marianne, may I ask—" said Eleanor gently. "No, Eleanor. Ask nothing. You will soon know all." This was said with a sort of desperate calmness, which lasted only as long as she spoke. It seemed probable that she was writing for the last time to Willoughby. The letter was given to a servant, to be delivered by hand, and the sisters went down to breakfast. Soon afterwards a letter arrived from Marianne, who went deathly pale and instantly ran out of the room. Mrs. Jennings laughed comfortably. "Is that a love letter from Willoughby? Well, well, I never saw a young woman so passionately in love in my life. I hope he won't keep her waiting much longer." Eager to know what Willoughby had written, Eleanor hurried to their room. Marianne was lying on her bed, sobbing violently. Eleanor took her sister's hand, kissed her affectionately several times, and burst into tears herself. Marianne, although unable to speak, seemed to feel her sister's loving sympathy, and silently gave her Willoughby's letter to read. "My dear Madam, I have just had the honour of receiving your letter, for which I thank you. I am concerned to find there was anything in my behaviour last night that you did not approve of, and I beg your forgiveness. I shall always remember my former visits to your family with the most grateful pleasure, but I hope I have never given anyone reason to think that I felt more for you than I ever expressed. You will accept that I could never have meant more when you understand that my affections have long been engaged, and it will not be many weeks before the lady and I are married. I obey your orders to return your letters and the lock of hair which you so kindly offered me. Your obedient servant, John Willoughby. Eleanor was horrified. She had expected a confession, explanations and reasons, but not expressed in a manner so far from every honourable and gentlemanly feeling. How could Willoughby have written a letter so cruel, so hurtful? It was a relief to her that Marianne had escaped any connection with such a man. She turned to her sister, who now felt able to speak. Poor Eleanor, how unhappy I make you. I only wish there were anything I could do which might be of comfort to you. Oh, Eleanor, I am so miserable, said Marianne, before her voice was completely lost in passionate and bitter sobbing. Calm yourself, dear Marianne. Think of how much more you would have suffered if the discovery of his real character had come at the end of your engagement. Engagement? Cried Marianne. There has been no engagement. He has not made or broken any promise to me. But he told you that he loved you? Yes. No, never absolutely. He never said it in so many words, but every day I read it in his eyes. I felt myself as firmly engaged as if lawyers had written the agreement for us. Unfortunately, he did not feel the same. He did, Eleanor. For weeks and weeks he did. This lock of hair which he says I offered him, he begged and begged me for it on his knees. And now, oh! Eleanor was quite alarmed for her sister's health, as the violence of her sobbing grew, but she managed to persuade her to take some medicine to calm her restless pain of mind and body. Kind Mrs. Jennings showed real concern when she visited the patient. She had heard that Marianne's rival was a Miss Grey, a young woman with £50,000 a year, and that Willoughby had seriously overspent on his carriages and horses and needed money urgently. Mrs. Jennings had no words hard enough to describe his behaviour. She was sincerely sorry she had joked so often about Marianne's attachment, but, with the return of her natural cheerfulness, hoped that it would all be for the best, because now Marianne could marry Colonel Brandon after all. Chapter 7. The Truth About Willoughby. The next day, Marianne felt just as miserable, and could talk about nothing but Willoughby. With affectionate words, Eleanor encouraged her to talk about her feelings. Marianne was determined to avoid Mrs. Jennings' presence, however. "She cannot feel, Eleanor," she cried. "Her kindness is not sympathy. She is only interested in me because she will enjoy telling her friends all the details of my sad situation." It is unfortunate that many people of excellent intelligence and character, like Marianne, are neither reasonable nor fair. Then something happened after breakfast, which sank Mrs. Jennings still lower in Marianne's opinion. The sisters were in their room when Mrs. Jennings hurried in, holding out a letter in her hand and with a cheerful smile on her face. "Now, my dear," she cried, "I bring you something that I am sure will do you good." At once, Marianne imagined a letter from Willoughby, full of affection and believable explanations, instantly followed by Willoughby himself, who would throw himself passionately at her feet. The work of one moment was destroyed by the next. In front of her eyes was her mother's writing, never unwelcome till then, and in the bitterness of her disappointment she felt she had reached the depths of her suffering. She could not speak, and the tears poured down her face. Mrs. Jennings was not at all aware of what she had done, and with many kind words of sympathy, soon left the Miss Dashwoods to read the letter together. It brought them no comfort, as it expressed Mrs. Dashwood's complete confidence in and affection for Willoughby. Marianne's tears flowed even faster when she thought how shocked and saddened her dear mother would be to hear the news. She was now very eager to return home to Devonshire. Eleanor sat down, with a heavy heart, to write to her mother again, telling her how Willoughby had behaved and asking what they should do. Just then, there was a knock on the front door, and Marianne, looking out of the window, saw Colonel Brandon outside. She hurried away to her room, and Eleanor remained to greet him. He seemed disturbed and unhappy, and asked anxiously after Marianne. "I have come, hoping to find you alone," he said in some confusion, "because my only wish is to give comfort, no, not comfort, to support your sister in this difficult time. My feeling for her, for yourself, for your mother. Will you allow me to prove it by telling you some details of... If I did not consider it useful, I would not bother you." He stopped. "I understand you," said Eleanor. "You have something to say about Mr. Willoughby that will open his character to us. Telling me would be the greatest proof of friendly feeling for Marianne. I beg you, let me hear it immediately." "I must tell you a little about myself first. Perhaps you remember, at Barton Park, when I mentioned a young lady I once knew. She was very like your sister, with an eager mind, a warm heart, and great sensibility. She was a distant cousin of mine, and from our earliest days we played together and loved each other. But at 17 she was married, against her wishes, to my brother. Just before the wedding, she and I planned to run away and get married secretly. But my father discovered the plan and sent me away to join the army. It was an extremely unhappy marriage. My brother did not love or respect her, and spent his time on pleasures most unsuitable for a husband. She was very young, had no friends or family to advise her. I had been sent abroad by then, and my brother's bad example was always with her. I cannot describe the shock I received when I heard, 2 years later, of her divorce. He could not speak for a moment, and when he saw Eleanor's concern and sympathy, took her hand and kissed it gratefully. When I returned to England 3 years later, I began to search for her, but she was no longer with her first seducer, the man for whom she had left her marriage. There was every reason to fear she had left him only to sink deeper into a life of dishonour. After 6 months, however, I did find her, in a debtor's prison. She was so changed, so thin, so ill. She had only a short while to live, so I made sure she was properly looked after, and I was with her in her last moments." He stopped for a moment to control himself, then went on. "With a firmer mind and a happier marriage, she could have been everything you will live to see in your sister. She left to my care her little girl Eliza, the child of her first seducer. I sent Eliza to school, and then put her in the care of a very respectable woman living in the country. She is now 17. Imagine my horror when she suddenly disappeared a year ago. For 8 long months I searched and found nothing. You can imagine what I thought and feared, and how I suffered." "Good heavens!" cried Eleanor. "Could Willoughby—" "The first news of Eliza came in the letter I received at Barton Park, on the morning of our planned excursion to Whitwell. That was why I left so suddenly. Willoughby did not know that I was called away to help someone he had made poor and miserable. But if he had known, would he have cared? No. He had done what no man of feeling would do. He had left the girl whose innocence he had seduced. Left her with no home, no friends, and no money." "This is beyond everything," cried Eleanor. "Now you understand what he is like. Imagine what I have felt all these weeks, knowing his character, and seeing your sister as fond of him as ever. Who can tell what his intentions were towards your sister? One day she will doubtless feel grateful when she compares her situation with that of my poor Eliza. At least there is no dishonour in your sister's suffering, and every friend of hers must feel concern for her unhappiness and respect for her bravery in bearing it." Eleanor thanked the Colonel warmly for his kind words. Have you, she continued, seen Willoughby since you left Barton? Yes, once, he replied seriously. As Eliza had confessed to me the name of her seducer, I accused him of dishonourable behaviour and challenged him to a duel. We met by appointment, but both of us returned unwounded. And my poor Eliza has had the child she was expecting, and now remains in the country. After this, the Colonel left, and Eleanor very soon passed on the details of the conversation to her sister. The effect was not quite what she had hoped. Marianne listened attentively, and appeared to accept Willoughby's guilt. She no longer avoided the Colonel when he came to the house, and talked to him in a gentle, pitying voice. But she seemed even more depressed, now that Willoughby's good character had been lost, as well as his heart. Mrs. Dashwood's letter of reply arrived next day. Her disappointment was almost more painful than Marianne's, and her anger even greater than Eleanor's. But she advised them not to shorten their stay with Mrs. Jennings, which had been expected to last 5 or 6 weeks, as a speedy return to Barton would only remind Marianne of former happy times with Willoughby. She also hoped that Eleanor would see more of the Ferrars family, who would soon be arriving in London. Sir John, Mrs. Jennings, and Mrs. Palmer all spoke forcefully about Willoughby, and determined to have nothing to do with him ever again. They talked so much about him, however, that it was a happy relief to Eleanor when Lady Middleton showed only calm and polite unconcern. Whenever the subject was discussed, she would say gently, "It is very shocking indeed." But privately, she was already planning to visit Mrs. Willoughby, who would be a woman of elegance and fortune. Mrs. Jennings was disappointed to see that the Colonel did not look more cheerful now that he no longer had a rival for Marianne. There seemed to be a better understanding between the elder Miss Dashwood and the Colonel, and Mrs. Jennings, who had quite forgotten Edward Ferrars, began to think that Eleanor would become Mrs. Brandon. A fortnight after Willoughby's letter had arrived, Eleanor had the painful duty of informing Marianne that he was married. Marianne received the news bravely at first and said nothing, but the tears came later, as wildly and as passionately as before. About this time, Eleanor was sorry to see the Miss Steeles arrive in London, as their presence always gave her pain. Lucy pretended to feel great delight in finding them in town, and Eleanor had to use all her self-control to answer politely. A pleasanter meeting took place a little later, when their brother, John Dashwood, came to visit them at Mrs. Jennings. He inquired after their health and their mother's, and was introduced to Colonel Brandon, who happened to be there. As it was a fine day, he asked Eleanor to take a short walk with him. As soon as they were out of the house, his questions began. "Who is Colonel Brandon? Is he a man of fortune?" "Yes, he has a large house with some land, and I believe about £2,000 a year." "I think, Eleanor, I will soon be congratulating you on making a very respectable marriage. He seems most gentlemanly, and he likes you, I'm sure of it." "He has not the smallest wish to marry me." "You are wrong, Eleanor. A very little effort on your side will catch him. Some of those little encouragements, which ladies can so easily give, will fix him, in spite of the smallness of your fortune. You should try for him. How amusing if Fanny had a brother and I had a sister marrying at the same time." "Is Mr. Edward Ferrars," Eleanor said calmly, "going to marry?" "It is not actually arranged yet, but the lady is Miss Morton, Lord Morton's only daughter, with £30,000 of her own. Edward's mother will most generously allow him 1,000 a year if he marries Miss Morton. I wish we could live so comfortably. I'm afraid our income is not large enough for us to live as we would like." And he shook his head sadly at the thought of his own difficulties. The following week, Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood gave a grand dinner party. The Middletons, Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon, the Miss Dashwoods, and the Miss Steeles were all invited. Eleanor and Lucy both knew that Mrs. Ferrars would be present as well. "Pity me, dear Miss Dashwood," whispered Lucy as they walked up the stairs. "In a moment I shall see the person on whom all my happiness depends, my future mother-in-law." Mrs. Ferrars was a little, thin woman with a disagreeable expression. She was not a woman of many words, but she made it very clear that she strongly disliked Eleanor and as strongly approved of Lucy. If she knew Lucy's secret, thought Eleanor amused, how she would hate her. She felt almost relieved that she could not now hope to become Edward's wife with such a mother-in-law. The next morning, Eleanor received a visit from Lucy, who had been so delighted by Mrs. Ferrars's welcoming behaviour to her that she felt she simply had to tell her dear friend about it. "She was so kind to me. Did you not notice it? And your sister-in-law too. What elegant, delightful women they are." Before Eleanor could bring herself to reply, the door opened and Edward walked in. It was a very difficult moment for the three of them, but Eleanor took control of the situation. Anxious to show that nothing was wrong, she welcomed him in her usual way. Lucy kept silent, watching Eleanor narrowly out of the corner of her eye, while Edward did not know what to say in his confusion and could not keep the conversation going. Soon Eleanor decided bravely to leave the engaged couple alone for a while and went to fetch Marianne. Rushing delightedly into the room, Marianne cried, "Dear Edward, this is a moment of great happiness," and looked lovingly at him and her sister. There was a short silence. "My dear Edward," Marianne continued, "why did you not come last night to your sister's dinner party? We were all there." "I had an appointment somewhere else." "An appointment? But was that so important when such friends wanted to see you?" "Perhaps, Miss Marianne," said Lucy smoothly, "you think young men never keep their appointments or their promises." Eleanor was very angry, but Marianne just answered, "No, I trust Edward. He is the most thoughtful, unselfish person I have ever met. He would never knowingly hurt anyone, I know." This praise was so unacceptable to Edward that he very soon got up to leave, and Eleanor had every reason to expect that this painful meeting would not be repeated. John and Fanny Dashwood continued to see Eleanor and Marianne at London parties and dances, and John began to wonder about inviting his sisters to stay for a few days. Fanny, however, was astonished at this suggestion. "My love, I would ask them with all my heart if it was possible, but I had just decided to ask the Miss Steeles to stay with us. We can ask your sisters some other year, you know." Mr. Dashwood agreed at once, and Fanny, delighting in her escape and proud of her quick thinking, wrote to invite Lucy and her sister. This made Lucy really happy. Such an opportunity of being near Edward and his family was the most useful thing in the world for her. And when the invitation was shown to Eleanor, she began for the first time to share Lucy's expectations and prepared herself to hear officially of the engagement. Chapter 8. Edward's Engagement. Mrs. Jennings was very busy at this time, as her daughter Charlotte had just had a baby and was clearly in need of a fond mother's advice. She visited Charlotte at least twice a day, and it was at the Palmer's house that she heard a most interesting piece of news. She hurried excitedly back to tell Eleanor. "My dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard? Your sister-in-law is ill, Charlotte's doctor told me, and do you know why? It appears that Edward Ferrars, the young man I used to joke with you about, has been engaged for over a year to Lucy Steele, and no one knew a word of the matter except her sister Anne. Could you have believed such a thing possible? What happened was this. The Miss Steeles are staying with your brother and his wife, as you know. Anne, who is a kind creature but of no great intelligence, thought that there would be no difficulty, as Fanny Dashwood seemed to like Lucy so much, so she told her all about the engagement. Well, your sister-in-law fell onto the floor and started sobbing and screaming so violently that your brother had to send for the doctor. Lucy and Anne were told to pack their bags and leave at once. Of course, the Ferrars family wanted Edward to marry that rich Miss Morton, but I have no pity for them. I cannot bear people who think money or greatness is important. There is no reason why Edward should not marry Lucy. She knows better than anyone how to make the most of everything, and if Edward's mother allowed him £500 a year, they could live comfortably. Mrs. Jennings, to Eleanor's relief, no longer suspected her of having any interest in Edward, but she could talk of nothing else. Eleanor, knowing that Marianne would be fierce in her anger against Edward, was now anxious to tell her sister the truth and to prepare her to hear the subject discussed. Marianne listened to Eleanor's story with horror and cried without stopping. For some time, Edward seemed a second Willoughby to her. She could not understand his behaviour or accept that he could feel affection for such a person as Lucy. "How long have you known this, Eleanor?" she asked. 4 months. Lucy told me of her engagement at Barton, and I promised to keep it secret. "What? All the time you were looking after me in my misery, this has been on your heart. How could you bear it?" "By feeling that I was doing my duty. I had to keep Lucy's secret, and I did not want to worry my family and friends." 4 months! And yet you loved him. "Yes, but I loved my family too, and I was glad to spare them the sorrow of knowing how I felt. Now I no longer feel unhappy. I do not consider Edward has behaved badly in any way, and I wish him every happiness. He will always do his duty, and Lucy does not lack sense. They will marry, and time will teach him to forget that he ever thought another woman better than her." "If such is your way of thinking, your self-control is perhaps a little less to be wondered at. I understand it better." "I know you do not suppose I have ever felt much, but Marianne, for 4 months I have had all this on my mind, and been unable to speak of it to a single creature. I was told about it by the person whose early engagement destroyed my hopes of happiness. She saw me as a rival, and was delighted to see me defeated. I have had to listen to her talking about Edward again and again. I have had to pretend to show no interest in him. I have had to bear the unkindness of his sister and the rudeness of his mother, without enjoying any of the advantages of an attachment to him. I know now that I shall be divided from Edward forever. If you can ever think me capable of feeling Marianne, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now." These words went straight to Marianne's heart. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How unkind I have been to you, you who have been my only comfort." And the two sisters fell sobbing into each other's arms. Marianne was so sorry she had misjudged her sister that she promised to do anything Eleanor wanted: to discuss the engagement in public without bitterness, to meet Lucy without showing any dislike, and even to talk to Edward himself, if chance brought them together, with her usual friendliness. The next morning brought a test of her self-control, when John Dashwood came to visit Mrs. Jennings and his sisters. "You have heard, I suppose," said he with a most serious expression, "of our very shocking discovery yesterday." Silently, they all showed that they had. It seemed too awful a moment to speak. "Your sister-in-law," he continued, "has suffered terribly. So too has Mrs. Ferrars, but I would not alarm you too greatly. The doctor says Fanny is strong and will get better in time. She says she will never think well of anybody again, and I cannot wonder at it, as she was so deceived. How ungrateful those young women were, after she had shown them so much kindness. I wish with all my heart, says poor Fanny in her affectionate way, that we had invited your sisters instead of them." Here he stopped to be thanked, then continued. "What poor Mrs. Ferrars suffered cannot be described. She could not believe Edward was secretly engaged, when all the time she had been planning a most excellent marriage for him. She sent for him, and he came to see her. I am sorry to tell you what happened next. All our attempts to persuade Edward to end the attachment were useless. Even when his mother explained that if he married Miss Morton, she would generously allow him £1,000 a year, and even when she offered to make it £1,200, he still insisted that he would not break the engagement. Mrs. Ferrars then told him he would receive no money at all from her, and if he entered any profession, she would do her best to prevent him succeeding in it. "Good heavens!" cried Marianne. "Can this be possible?" "Your surprise is very natural, Marianne," said her brother. "It is astonishing that Edward could not be persuaded." Marianne, about to disagree fiercely, remembered her promises to Eleanor, and said nothing. "Well," cried Mrs. Jennings, "I think he has behaved like an honest man. He must keep his promise to marry Lucy Steele. If he broke it, the world would think him a worthless scoundrel." "I respect your views, madam," said John Dashwood politely, "but I am afraid that a good, thoughtful mother like Mrs. Ferrars, with such a very large fortune, cannot approve of her son's secret engagement to this most unsuitable young woman. I am sorry to say that it has all ended in a most unhappy separation. Mrs. Ferrars told Edward to leave her house, and he obeyed at once. She does not wish to see him ever again, and has now decided very understandably that Robert, not Edward, should inherit her fortune when she dies. Poor Edward. His younger brother will be wealthy while he remains poor. I feel for him sincerely." John Dashwood left soon afterwards, and the three ladies immediately joined together in their firm disapproval of Mrs. Ferrars' behaviour and their warm praise of Edward's. The next morning, Eleanor received a letter from Lucy. "I hope, my dear Miss Dashwood, you will not mind my writing to you. I know that, as a true friend, you will be pleased to hear my news. Edward and I, although we have suffered terribly in all our recent troubles, are quite well now, thank God, and happy in each other's love. We are very grateful to our friends, yourself not the least among them, for helping us through our many difficulties. I shall always remember your great kindness, and so will Edward. I am sure you will be glad to hear that I spent 2 happy hours with him yesterday. I offered him his freedom, and was ready to consider our engagement at an end, if that was what he wanted. But he would not hear of it, and said he did not care about his mother's anger, as long as he had my affections. Life will not be easy for us, it is true, but we must wait and hope for the best. He will enter the church soon, and if you ever have the opportunity to recommend him to anybody who can give him a living, I am sure you will not forget us. And dear Mrs. Jennings, too. I hope she will say a good word for us to any friend who may be able to help us. I beg you to remember me to her most gratefully and respectfully, and to Sir John and Lady Middleton, and the dear children, and give my love to Miss Marianne. Yours truly, Lucy Steele." Eleanor felt sure that Lucy wanted the letter to be seen by Mrs. Jennings, and showed it to her immediately. Mrs. Jennings was full of praise for Lucy's warm heart. "How prettily she writes," she said. "She calls me dear Mrs. Jennings, you see. I wish I could get him a living with all my heart." The Miss Dashwoods had now been in London for more than 2 months, and Marianne was becoming more and more impatient to go home. She missed the air, the freedom, the quiet of the country. Eleanor, although almost as anxious to leave as her sister, was aware of the difficulties of a long journey. This problem appeared to be solved when the Palmers invited Mrs. Jennings and the Miss Dashwoods to their home in Somerset, only a day's journey away from Barton. They planned to travel there at the end of March. The invitation was gladly accepted. Eleanor and Marianne would stay a week with the Palmers, and then continue their journey to Barton. Soon after this arrangement had been made, Colonel Brandon called at Mrs. Jennings' house and was told the news. "My dear Colonel, I do not know what you and I will do without the Miss Dashwoods," said Mrs. Jennings. "How lonely and dull we shall be." She hoped these words, and the sad picture they painted, would persuade him to make the offer of marriage which might prevent any loneliness or dullness in the future. And with delight she saw that her plan had succeeded. When Eleanor moved to a quiet corner of the room, Colonel Brandon joined her there and talked very seriously to her for several minutes. Although Mrs. Jennings was too honourable to listen, she could not help seeing that Eleanor was blushing and looking agitated. Some of the Colonel's words reached Mrs. Jennings' ears and astonished her greatly. "I do apologise for the smallness of the house." What could he mean? She knew very well that there were 15 bedrooms and 5 sitting rooms in his house at Delaford. "I am afraid it cannot happen soon." What an unlover-like thing to say! There could be no reason at all to delay their marriage. In fact, the Colonel was talking on a quite different subject. He had heard of Edward's difficulties, and knowing him to be a friend of Eleanor's, wished to help the young man. A living at Delaford had just become vacant, and the Colonel was asking Eleanor to offer it to Edward. At least it would be a start for Mr. Ferrars. The vicar's duties there are light, and there is a cottage that goes with the post, although I do apologise for the smallness of the house. The income is only £200 a year, so I am afraid his marriage cannot happen very soon. Eleanor expressed her grateful thanks for the Colonel's generous offer and promised to tell Edward the good news. When Colonel Brandon had left, Mrs. Jennings spoke to Eleanor with a knowing smile. "Well, Miss Dashwood, I couldn't help overhearing the Colonel's words, and I can tell you I was never better pleased in my life." "Yes," said Eleanor, "it is a matter of great happiness to me, but I was so surprised when he spoke to me about it." "My dear, I am not in the least astonished by it. I wish you every happiness, and if I want to see a happy couple, I know where to look for them in the future." "At Delaford, I suppose," said Eleanor with a smile. "That's right, my dear, and I can tell you you won't find the house small. Now I must go out, but we'll continue our conversation later. I'm sure you want to tell your sister about it." "Certainly, madam, but I shall not mention it to anyone else at present." "Oh," said Mrs. Jennings, disappointed. "Then you would prefer me not to tell Charlotte, or Sir John, or Lucy?" "Yes, madam, if you don't mind. I must speak to Mr. Ferrars first to arrange matters with him." This was at first extremely puzzling for Mrs. Jennings, but after a moment's thought she had a happy idea. Edward must be the vicar they had chosen to carry out the wedding ceremony. She hurried excitedly off on her morning visits, aware of the important secret that she was not allowed to tell. By chance, as she left the house, she met Edward at the door. He had called only to leave a note, but Mrs. Jennings insisted on his going in to see Miss Dashwood, who had particular news to give him. Eleanor had begun to write a letter to Edward when she looked up to find him standing in front of her. Her astonishment and confusion were very great. Edward, too, was confused, and for a few moments neither knew what to say to the other. At last, however, the Colonel's offer was made, and Edward, although astonished at this kindness from a stranger, was deeply grateful for the opportunity. He soon realised that he owed more than he could express to Eleanor, and also began to suspect that the Colonel might have a particular reason for wishing to help any friend of hers. There was sadness in his eyes as he rose to say goodbye. "When I see him again," said Eleanor to herself as the door shut behind him, "I shall see him, the husband of Lucy." When Mrs. Jennings returned, she was eager to find out more. "Well, my dear, and how soon will the young man be ready?" "In 2 or 3 months, I imagine," replied Eleanor. 2 or 3 months? My dear, how calmly you talk. Can the Colonel wait so long? I know you wish to do a kindness to Mr. Ferrars, but could you not find someone who is already a vicar?" "My dear madam, what can you be thinking of? The Colonel's only intention is to be of use to Mr. Ferrars." "Good heavens, my dear! Surely you do not mean that the Colonel only marries you in order to give £10 to Mr. Ferrars as his vicar's fee for the ceremony?" The confusion could not continue after this, and there was much amusement as Eleanor explained. Mrs. Jennings was just as delighted with the true situation and looked forward to visiting Lucy and Edward in the vicar's house at Delaford in a few months' time. Eleanor now knew that Edward's marriage to Lucy was certain. She herself had helped to smooth the path towards it. Chapter 9. Marianne's Illness. Before leaving London, Eleanor paid one last visit to her brother and his wife. Fanny did not wish to see her and stayed in her room, but John was very interested in the news of Edward's good luck. He could not understand why the Colonel should give away a living when he could have sold it. But he had something more particular to say to his sister. Taking her hand, he spoke in a very serious whisper. "There is one thing I must say, because I know it will please you. I know, in fact, Fanny heard her mother say, that although perhaps she did not approve of a certain attachment of Edward's, you understand me, it would have been far preferable to her than this engagement to Miss Steele. Of course, all that is quite in the past now and out of the question, but I thought I would just tell you, my dear Eleanor. Not that you have any reason to be sad. There is no doubt of your doing extremely well. Has Colonel Brandon been with you lately?" Eleanor was glad to be spared the need to reply by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferrars. She had only met him once before, and had found him a thoughtless and insensitive young man, full of his own self-importance. This short meeting only served to support her low opinion of his head and heart. He talked happily of Edward's inheritance, which he would now enjoy, and laughed loudly at the idea of Edward as a poor vicar living in a cottage. "His engagement certainly was very shocking news," he added. "I said to my mother, 'My dear madam, I do not know what you intend to do, but for myself I must say that if Edward marries this young woman, I shall never see him again.' I saw the girl once, you know, just a plain country girl with no elegance or beauty. I cannot help thinking that if I had heard of the connection earlier, I could have persuaded Edward to break it off. But now it is all too late. He must be punished, that is certain." Eleanor was relieved that she could not stay long, and sincerely hoped she would not see Robert Ferrars again. The journey to Cleveland, the Palmers' home in Somerset, took 2 days. Their house was comfortable and modern, with large, well-kept gardens and woods. On her arrival, Marianne went straight into the garden. She was feeling more agitated than usual, aware of being only 80 miles from Barton, and only 30 from Willoughby's country house. But she loved being back in the romantic countryside. She determined to spend as much time as possible taking lonely walks through the gardens and woods. Alone, she would be free to delight in her misery, thinking, dreaming, remembering. The hours passed quietly at Cleveland. Mrs. Palmer had her child, and Mrs. Jennings her sewing. Eleanor was surprised to find Mr. Palmer very capable of being a pleasant companion, and only occasionally rude to his wife and mother-in-law. Colonel Brandon, who was also a guest of the Palmers, spent a great deal of time with Eleanor, talking to her about the vicar's house at Delaford and the repairs he was planning to have done to it. His pleasure in her conversation and his respect for her opinion would have been enough to justify Mrs. Jennings' view of his attachment, and even, perhaps, to make Eleanor suspect it herself. She still felt certain, however, that while he spoke to her, it was Marianne at whom he looked, and of whom he thought. When Marianne mentioned that she had a sore throat and felt unwell, the Colonel appeared extremely worried. In his concern, Eleanor saw the quick feelings and needless alarm of a lover. 2 delightful evening walks in thick wet grass had given Marianne a violent cold. She felt heavy and feverish, with pains all over her body, but at first refused all medicines, saying that a good night's rest was all that she needed. The next day, however, she was worse, unable to do anything except lie miserably on a sofa, and after another restless, feverish night, Eleanor was ready to send for the Palmers' doctor. After examining his patient, he said that she was suffering from an infection and would recover in a few days. But the word infection greatly alarmed Mrs. Palmer, who feared that her baby might catch it, and she persuaded her husband to take her and the child to stay with a near relation until there was no further danger of illness at Cleveland. Mrs. Jennings kindly insisted on staying with the Miss Dashwoods, as she felt responsible for the young ladies in their mother's absence, and Colonel Brandon also offered to stay in case a gentleman's help was needed. Poor Marianne now felt really ill and extremely miserable, as their return to Barton would have to be considerably delayed. Several days passed, and Marianne's condition remained the same. The doctor came every day, talking each time of a speedy recovery, and Eleanor was just as hopeful. In her letters home, she had not told her mother of the seriousness of Marianne's illness, and now congratulated herself on not alarming Mrs. Dashwood unnecessarily. But that evening, Marianne became restless again, and Eleanor stayed beside her bed, watching her turning feverishly from side to side. Suddenly Marianne sat up and cried wildly, "Is Mamma coming?" "Not yet," replied Eleanor, hiding her terror and helping her sister to lie down again. "It is a long way from Barton." "But she must come soon," cried Marianne desperately. "I shall never see her again if she does not come soon." Eleanor was so alarmed that she sent for the doctor at once, and decided to send a messenger to Barton to fetch her mother. She spoke immediately to Colonel Brandon, who, although greatly depressed and fearing the worst, was ready to help in any way, and offered to drive to Barton himself. How grateful Eleanor was for the comfort of such a friend as the Colonel at that moment. Not a second was lost in delay of any kind, and the Colonel drove off into the night, leaving Eleanor to watch over her sister. Both sisters suffered greatly during that night, Marianne in her sleepless pain and fever, and Eleanor in cruel anxiety that her mother would arrive too late to see her dear child alive. When the doctor came, he had to confess that his medicines had failed and that the infection was stronger than ever. Eleanor was calm, except when she thought of her mother, but she was almost without hope. She stayed by her sister's bed all morning, her thoughts confused and sorrowful. But at midday she began to see signs of the fever going down. Cautiously she told herself not to hope, but soon it seemed almost certain. And on the doctor's next visit, he was able to congratulate her on Marianne's slow but sure recovery. Mrs. Jennings showed her delight by talking and laughing without stopping, but Eleanor's feelings were of a different kind. Her relief and happiness were strong, but silent. That evening, Marianne fell into a quiet, comfortable sleep, and Eleanor knew that at last she was out of danger. Her thoughts now began to turn to her mother's arrival, which was expected at any moment. Mrs. Jennings persuaded her to leave Marianne's bedside for a few minutes to drink some tea, but Eleanor soon returned to sit by her sleeping sister and wait for the travellers from Barton. The night was cold and stormy, but as long as Marianne slept peacefully, Eleanor did not mind the beating of the rain on the windows or the noise of the wind blowing round the house. At 8 o'clock, she heard a carriage drive up to the front door. Knowing what her poor mother must be feeling, Eleanor found it impossible to be calm and hurried downstairs. She rushed into the sitting room and saw Willoughby. With a look of horror, she stepped backwards and was about to leave the room, when he said rapidly, "Miss Dashwood, I beg you to stay. I have something I must tell you." Eleanor was astonished. "To tell me?" "Well, sir, if you must. But be quick, I have no time to spare. Tell me first, is your sister really out of danger?" "We hope she is," replied Eleanor coldly. "Thank God! I heard she was ill, and I have driven all day to get here. I have come to offer some kind of explanation, to show you that I have not always been a scoundrel, and to receive something like forgiveness from your sister. Marianne has already forgiven you." "Has she?" he cried eagerly. "But listen, I must explain. When I first met your family, I had no other intention than to pass the time pleasantly while in Devonshire. My income was never large, and my debts are always very great, so I was planning to attach myself to a woman of fortune. But I soon found myself sincerely fond of your sister, and the happiest hours of my life were spent with her. I allowed myself, most wrongly, to put off asking her to marry me. At last I determined to speak of marriage, but unfortunately my relation, Mrs. Smith, had just discovered a connection. He reddened and looked away. But you have probably heard the whole story from Colonel Brandon. I have, replied Eleanor, also blushing, and I cannot see how you will explain away your part in that terrible business. No, I know I was at fault, cried Willoughby, but I must ask you to believe that I had no idea Eliza was in such need. I suffered too because Mrs. Smith was extremely angry at my behaviour and refused to allow me any more money or see me again. I knew that if I married Marianne I would be poor, and I couldn't bear the thought of that. So I came to Barton Cottage to say goodbye to her. How happy I had been the day before, ready to become engaged to her, and how miserable I was when I saw her sorrow and deep disappointment. Oh, God, what a hard-hearted scoundrel I was! There was a short silence, while Willoughby recovered his self-control, and Eleanor's heart softened a little towards him. And then, in London, Marianne's notes to me. Every word was a knife in my heart. She was far dearer to me than any other woman in the world, but by then I was engaged to Miss Grey. Do not speak like that of my sister, Mr. Willoughby, said Eleanor. Remember that you are a married man now. He began to laugh wildly. Married, yes. Did you like the letter I wrote to Marianne? Miss Grey happened to see Marianne's last note to me and read it. Her jealous anger made her think of a cruel punishment for me. She told me what to write and watched over me as I wrote the letter. They were all her own gentle words, her own sweet thoughts. I could not risk losing her. I needed her money to pay my debts. You ought not to speak of Mrs. Willoughby in this way. You have made your choice, and should respect your wife. She does not deserve your pity. I have no chance of domestic happiness with her. But do you think me less guilty than before? Will you tell your sister, when she has recovered, what I have told you? If ever, one day, by some happy chance, I were free again— Eleanor stopped him with a frown. Well, I shall leave now. I shall live in terror of one event— your sister's marriage. She can never be more lost to you than she is now. But someone else will have her, and if that someone were he whom of all men I could least bear— But I must go. Goodbye. And he almost ran out of the room. Eleanor's heart was full as she returned to her sleeping sister. The past, the present, the future, Willoughby's visit and the pity she felt for him, Marianne's health and her mother's expected arrival, made her so agitated that she did not notice her hunger or tiredness. Only half an hour later, a second carriage arrived at the house. Eleanor hurried to the door, just in time to receive and support her mother as she entered, half dead with fear. In a moment, Eleanor was able to give the good news, and Mrs. Dashwood's tears silently expressed her relief. Colonel Brandon shared her feelings in an even greater silence. In 2 minutes, Mrs. Dashwood was with her suffering child, made dearer than ever by absence, unhappiness, and danger. Marianne's recovery continued every day, and Mrs. Dashwood soon found an opportunity to tell Eleanor another piece of news. On the long drive from Barton to Cleveland, Colonel Brandon had been unable to hide his feelings, and had told Mrs. Dashwood that he had long wanted to marry Marianne. Mrs. Dashwood was now as certain of the Colonel's excellent character as she had once been of Willoughby's, and hoped that Marianne would, in time, come to accept Colonel Brandon's offer of marriage. Chapter 10. Return to Barton. Marianne recovered so well that within a week she was able to travel home with her mother and Eleanor in Colonel Brandon's carriage. Eleanor was pleased to see that Marianne showed a new firmness of mind and calmness of expression. Although she was clearly still upset when she thought of the past, she was now able to control her feelings and show a cheerful face to her family. She started planning a new life for herself. "When I am stronger, Eleanor, we will take long walks together every day. I shall never get up later than 6, and I shall spend every morning practicing my music or reading." Eleanor smiled, doubting whether this plan would last very long, but happy to see Marianne enthusiastic again. A couple of days later, the weather was so fine that Mrs. Dashwood encouraged Eleanor to take Marianne out for a gentle walk, and the sisters set out along the quiet country road. "There, exactly there," said Marianne, pointing to the hill behind the house, "is where I fell and first saw Willoughby. I am thankful to find that I can see the place with so little pain. Can we talk on that subject now, do you think, Eleanor?" She was affectionately encouraged to speak openly. "I know how badly I have behaved. My illness has given me time to think. I should never have been so incautious in my behaviour with Willoughby, and so impolite to other people. I know now that my own uncontrolled feelings caused my suffering, and even my illness was all my own fault. I have been unkind and unfair to almost everybody I know, but especially to you, dearest Eleanor. Did I follow your example? No. Did I help or comfort you when you were suffering? No. I only thought of my own sorrow and my own broken heart." Eleanor, impatient to calm her, praised her honesty. "I can never forget Willoughby," continued Marianne, "but my memories no longer make me miserable. If I only knew that he did not always intend to deceive me, that he had some good in him, I would have much greater peace of mind." Eleanor took a deep breath and passed on to her sister what Willoughby had told her. Marianne said nothing, but tears ran down her face. They were now on their way back to the cottage, and as they reached the door, she kissed Eleanor gratefully, whispered, "Tell Mamma," and went slowly upstairs. When Mrs. Dashwood heard the story, she expressed some pity for Willoughby, but for her nothing could remove the guilt of his behaviour towards Eliza and then Marianne. In the evening, when they were all together, Marianne spoke again of Willoughby. "I wish to tell you both," she told her mother and Eleanor in a trembling voice, "that what Eleanor told me this morning was a great relief to me. I could never have been happy with him after knowing all this." I know," cried her mother. "My Marianne, happy with a scoundrel like that? No." "Marianne, you consider the matter," said Eleanor, "exactly as a sensible person should. And I expect you realise that marriage to him would have involved you in many troubles and disappointments. You would always have been poor, and perhaps your influence on his heart would have lessened, as he realised his selfish demands could not be met." "Selfish? Do you think him selfish?" said Marianne. "Yes, you are right. It is true. How foolish I was." "I am more to blame than you, my child," said Mrs. Dashwood. "I should have discovered his intentions earlier." During the next few days, Marianne continued to get stronger, and life at Barton fell back into the old routines. Eleanor grew impatient for some news of Edward, but the news arrived in a rather unexpected way. Mrs. Dashwood's manservant, Thomas, had been sent to Exeter one morning on business, and on his return finished his report with these words: "I suppose you know, madam, that Mr. Ferrars is married?" Marianne looked quickly at Eleanor's white face and burst into uncontrolled sobbing. Mrs. Dashwood did not know which daughter to take care of first. She and Margaret led Marianne to another room, and then Mrs. Dashwood hurried back to Eleanor, who, although clearly upset, had been able to start questioning Thomas. At once, Mrs. Dashwood took that trouble upon herself. "Who told you that Mr. Ferrars was married, Thomas?" "I saw him myself, madam, with his lady, Miss Steele, as her name was then. Miss Steele called to me from a carriage and asked after the young lady's health. Then she smiled and said she had changed her name since she was last in Devon." "Was Mr. Ferrars in the carriage with her?" "Yes, madam. He was sitting next to her, but I didn't see his face, and Mr. Ferrars isn't a gentleman for talking much." "Did Mrs. Ferrars look well?" "Yes, madam, very well and extremely happy." Thomas was then sent away, and Eleanor and her mother sat in thoughtful silence. Mrs. Dashwood now realised that Eleanor had hidden her feelings for Edward in order to spare her mother any unhappiness. She felt guilty that Marianne's suffering had taken up so much of her time, when her eldest daughter was probably just as much in need of her care and attention. Eleanor herself was extremely miserable. She had always had a secret hope that something might happen to prevent his marrying Lucy. But now he really was married, and she could not bear the thought of it. A few days later, a gentleman was seen riding up to their front door. At first, Eleanor thought it must be Colonel Brandon, but it was not him. In fact, it looked just like Edward. She looked again. It was Edward. She moved away from the window and sat down. "I will be calm. I must be calm." Her mother and sisters had recognised Edward too, but not a word was spoken, and they all waited in silence for their visitor to appear. He entered, looking pale, agitated, and afraid. Mrs. Dashwood greeted him kindly and wished him every happiness. He blushed and said something no one could hear. Eleanor desperately began to talk about the weather. When she had finished expressing her extreme delight in the dryness of the season, a very awful pause took place. It was ended by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt it necessary to hope that Mrs. Ferrars was well. Edward replied hurriedly that she was. Another pause. "Is Mrs. Ferrars in Plymouth?" asked Eleanor bravely. "Plymouth?" he said, surprised. "No, my mother is in London." "I meant," said Eleanor, taking up her sewing from the table, "to ask about Mrs. Edward Ferrars." He blushed, looked puzzled, hesitated, then said, "Perhaps you mean my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" repeated Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood in the greatest astonishment. Eleanor could not speak. "Yes," said Edward hurriedly. "You may not have heard that my brother is now married to Miss Lucy Steele." Eleanor could sit there no longer. She ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of happiness. Until then, Edward had avoided looking at her. Now he watched her hurry away and seemed to fall into a dream. At last, without saying a word, he got up, left the room, and walked out of the house. Great was the astonishment he left behind him. One thing, however, was certain. Edward was now free, and it was not hard to guess how he would use this freedom. Walking about in the fresh air made him feel brave enough to return, and when they all sat down to tea at 4 o'clock, Edward had won his lady, gained her mother's permission, and was the happiest man alive. His heart was now open to Eleanor, with his weaknesses and mistakes confessed, and his boyish attachment to Lucy discussed with all the wise experience of a man of 24. "My engagement to Lucy certainly was foolish," said he, "but it would not have happened if my mother had allowed me to choose a profession. I had nothing to do. and no friends to advise me, so I imagined myself in love. When I met you, my dear Eleanor, I realised at once how weak I had been. Eleanor's mother and sisters were delighted. They could not love Edward enough, nor praise Eleanor enough. And Eleanor, how can her feelings be described? From the moment of learning that Edward was free, to the moment of his asking her to marry him, her mind was in a storm. But when all doubt was past, and she heard his voice expressing his deep love and affection for her, she knew her happiness was complete. Edward stayed at the cottage for a week, and one of the first subjects of discussion was, of course, Lucy's marriage. It appeared that Robert had visited her several times, trying to persuade her to set Edward free. Lucy had realised that it was now Robert, not Edward, who would inherit his mother's fortune. Being of similarly selfish character, they were attracted to each other and decided to get married with speed and secrecy. Edward's mother was naturally horrified by Robert's marriage. She did not greatly approve of Edward's engagement to Eleanor either, but in the end was persuaded to accept it, and even, rather unwillingly, gave Edward £10,000. She had given the same to Fanny on her marriage. This was much more than was expected by Edward and Eleanor, who could now afford to marry very soon and move into the vicar's house at Delaford. There they were visited by all their friends and relations, who found them one of the happiest couples in the world. Even Mrs. Ferrars came to visit them, although they were never favourites with her. That honour was reserved for Robert and Lucy, who, by endless attentions and respectful messages, finally regained their place in her heart. The whole of Lucy's behaviour in the matter may be seen as a most encouraging example of what self-interest can do to gain wealth and position. With Mrs. Ferrars' generous help, Robert and Lucy lived in great comfort, often visiting John and Fanny Dashwood. Only their frequent domestic disagreements spoiled their happiness. Eleanor's move to Delaford did not separate her from her family, as her mother and sisters spent half their time with her. Mrs. Dashwood was anxious to bring Marianne and Colonel Brandon together, which was also Eleanor's and Edward's wish. Knowing how good, how kind the Colonel was, and how fondly he was attached to her, what could Marianne do? At the age of 17, she had believed that passionate feeling was the most important thing in life. She had had her heart broken and learnt to recover from it. Then, at 19, with feelings of only warm friendship and respect, she agreed to marry a man she had once considered dull and far too old for marriage. But so it was. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who loved him believed he deserved to be, and Marianne, who could never love by halves, came in time to love her husband as much as she had loved Willoughby. Willoughby himself was saddened to hear of her marriage, but he did not die of a broken heart. He even managed to get some enjoyment out of life, as his wife was not always unpleasant, and his home not always uncomfortable. But Marianne remained his idea of the perfect woman, and he often refused to admire a new young beauty as nothing to compare with Mrs. Brandon. Mrs. Dashwood stayed on at Barton Cottage, and as Margaret soon grew old enough for dancing and falling in love, Sir John and Mrs. Jennings did not miss Eleanor and Marianne as much as they had feared. Barton and Delaford were connected by strong family affection, and there was constant communication between the two places. Eleanor and Marianne lived in great happiness, loved and respected by their husbands, and almost within sight of each other. The passing of the years only served to bring them all closer together.